Hello and welcome to Grief Tending. This podcast series is aimed at supporting anyone who's in a caregiving role, whether that's professional or non-professional, to someone who's grieving. And these conversations are seeking to cultivate our collective capacities to be alongside grief in supportive ways. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners and custodians on whose unceded land these interviews are recorded, the Turrbal and Yagara peoples, to acknowledge their ongoing connection to land, waters, and culture, and to pay respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'd also like to extend that respect to any First Nations people who are listening. Today's episode is titled on Cultivating Compassionate Workplaces and Tending Grief Through Ceremony, and it sits in the community stream of our series. And our guest on this episode is Jessie Williams. Jessie has held multiple leadership roles to improve dying and grief in Australia since 2015. Some of these previous positions include being board director, executive officer, and CEO of the Groundswell Project, a not-for-profit organisation known for using innovative arts and health programs to create social and cultural change about death and dying. Jessie's been the co-chair of the End of Life and Palcare Stakeholder Engagement Working Group, the Ministry of Health in New South Wales, and also a part of the Death and Dying Advisory Group through the Research Centre for Palliative Care. Jessie, through her own lived experience of end-of-life care and grief, is passionate about advocating death can be done differently, whilst encouraging grassroots and organisational leadership to adopt non-clinically driven models of social support and end-of-life education. Jessie is a TEDx speaker and regularly delivers presentations to workplaces and place-based communities. She graduated from the University of Sydney in 1999 with an arts degree and holds postgraduate qualifications in training and leadership. She's currently the manager of community programs, which includes the Groundswell Project, at CCNB, which is the largest not-for-profit community-led organisation in Australia supporting people to navigate the health and social care systems. So today's episode sits within the community stream of our series and is titled Cultivating Compassionate Workplaces and Tending Grief Through Ceremony. In the conversation with Jessie, as with a number of our guests in the series, it might be helpful if you would consider pausing at this introduction and just looking at a couple of the resources that are attached to this episode. There's a couple that might really help you contextualize the rest of the discussion that we have, almost like a primer for this conversation. So one of those is the TED Talk that Jessie gave in 2018, which was titled "Is Death the Way to Bring Us Back to Community?" And in that presentation, Jessie was speaking both about her own lived experience of becoming a bereaved parent and also the work with the Groundswell Project, which, if you're not familiar with, has, for many years been through kind of grassroots advocacy for social change at sort of a few different levels, been asking this question of what would it be if, when someone in our community died, that we all knew what to do, or we all were death-informed or grief-informed. So it might be helpful to go and look at those things first. But if you're already familiar with Jessie's work or with Groundswell, then it might be that you jump right into this conversation. So, in thinking around cultivating compassionate workplaces and tending grief through ceremony, we started the conversation by kind of, I suppose, exploring a little bit of a recap of the Groundswell Project and the work that they have done over the last decade in seeking to upgrade the way we do death, as they would say. But then we kind of focused in on one specific area that I wanted to talk about, which was the way in which workplaces can become more grief-informed and more prepared to support bereaved people who are returning to work. This can often be such a challenge for grieving people. They're returning to, assuming someone's not starting a new job early in bereavement, they're returning to a world that they knew, that had a whole series of expectations around, particularly if it's a grieving parent, there were a series of expectations around how that return to work would look, and it's now a very different reality. Similarly, when when adults return to work after the death of a spouse or another family member who may have been living with illness for a long time. It's a familiar world, and yet it's changed. So we spoke about, kind of some more conceptual principles, considerations in the background, as well as some very practical, sort of guidance. So perhaps it is that you might consider, thinking about your own workplace and wondering how grief informed is the HR department, if you have one, where you work, and what might it mean for us to upgrade the way that we respond to grief in the workplace. The other really interesting focus of our conversation was also looking at the role of grief ceremony in tending to grief, and exploring how grief gatherings, can bring this is something that's quite old, this return to ceremony and ritual, that there are some parts of grieving that aren't addressed or we don't come into contact with certain parts of our grief experience through podcasts or online tip sheets or peer support groups, as helpful as those things can be. There's something about the symbolic container of a ceremonial space, whether that has a religious or a cultural framing to it, that could offer something, and people tell us does offer something unique in the way that grief is acknowledged and witnessed, often in that mysterious place beyond words that some people might attach words like spiritual or soulful to. And often what I think people are saying when they use words like that is that there's some sort of encounter with a profound or mysterious part of what it is to be human, and especially humans who are grieving very personal and painful losses in their lives. So I really valued the way in which Jessie was reflecting on her connection with a particular grief ceremony that happens in her community, and how over the years her role in that has changed from attending in the early years of her own bereavement through to becoming more involved as a supporter and organizer of that event, and a support in turn to new people who arrive and join that community. So I feel like both of these threads of the conversation are really valuable, and I hope they may offer you some practical kind of support areas to consider and reflect on in how it might be that you make space for grief in your community. Thank you. Hi, Jessie. Thanks so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. How you doing, Alan?
Yeah, I'm well, thanks.
That's good.
So I wanted to start off, Jessie, you're with the Groundswell Project, and it's an organization that seeks to support people in community to respond, with compassion to all the things surrounding death and dying and the experiences of grief that are woven through that. So just wanted to ask you to start us off, for anyone who's not familiar with Groundswell, could you tell us about the work that you do?
Yeah, sure. So we really set out to do death differently. And that's actually a phrase that you see now in Australia from perhaps palliative care services and other community groups. So doing death differently, what does that actually mean? It really means inviting people to consider end of life in a way that feels a little bit different. And when I say different, I guess we need to start with this notion that dying has changed. 200 years ago, we mainly died in our homes and in community with the support of family and friends. And then we developed really good medical care and really good disease management. And now we have this amazing health system that keeps us going beyond 50 years of age, 60 years of age, 70 years of age. But we've kind of created a new problem with that. So what we recognized, what our founders recognized at the Groundswell Project was we've kind of institutionalized what is a very normal, natural part of being alive, and that is the dying process and certainly death care. And so we wanted to kind of take it back and remind and remember in our communities that we actually know how to do death very well. We've perhaps just forgotten. So doing death differently is not so much about romanticizing some early age of dying, but it is about reminding each other that we actually have it inbuilt in us, the knowledge and the wisdom of how to navigate this stuff. But perhaps doing death differently also requires new services, new programs, new campaigns to reignite. So over 10 years, 12 years of Groundswell, we did a lot of things new. We did a lot of things for the first time. So, we did some projects with high schools, for example, where we would work with drama students to engage with people, for example, with motor neuron disease, to ask them questions. What is it like to know that you've got limited life left? And then those drama students would create a performance piece and perform it for their peers. And so there's a lot of creative ways we can involve people in the conversations around death and dying, always proving that talking about death doesn't kill you. And then, halfway through our life, we established Dying to Know Day, which is now a national grassroots campaign where across Australia there are over 300 events each year held by members of the community and members of the health system to invite people into this conversation in new, exciting ways. So, yeah, busy little beavers at Groundswell.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I was kind of reflecting on how at the core of that work, and there's many different areas or kind of aspects of community that you have kind of put those energies. At the core of that, it's around helping people to be well resourced to support people now, but into the future, who inevitably will experience death, illness, grief. And, you mentioned schools just before, and, the other area, I suppose, that, most people, or commonly people, would spend most of their waking hours outside of the home would be the workplace.
Yeah.
And this is I think such an important area of care and support, and one which is often not as prevalent. There's lots of resources if you look online for direct support for a grieving person in different circumstances or situations, but the workplace seems to have gotten less attention. So I was really interested to talk with you, about your experience in that for a couple of reasons. I know that's something that you have had personal lived experience of, but also given professional energies to. And we know that people can have such varied experiences of, especially returning to work after the death of a family member.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So could you share some insights, on that as we kind of talk about grief in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're right. Work is a part of our lives. We're not, we're expected to bring our full selves to work. Most industries, most professions these days, we're expecting people to have emotional intelligence, to have friendships in the workplace. And certainly now with hybrid work for most industries in Australia, we have our workplace in our home. Right now, you're talking to me in my home office. And I can hear my dog and my husband and Star Trek being played in the lounge room. And so work experience and personal experiences are all intermingled. So why wouldn't we talk about grief in the workplace? And why wouldn't we talk about our colleagues being in many ways part of the front line of our support? So I think we've got a long way to go. I think in the workplace currently, the way we support and we recognise, or don't, and support grief is we hand the card of the employee assistance program over. We offer the workplace psychologist, whether they're on site or whether they're outside of the building. Now, that is a really wonderful service. We all need a listening, kind, skilled ear from time to time. But I think there's a bit of a question about how fast and how quickly we hand that card over. Because when we hand that card over, and sometimes what we're saying is, you can go and talk to that person about your feelings. You don't need to bring them to me, right?
Take that somewhere else.
Take that somewhere else. And so this really opens up a space for us to consider, what is our role when someone is grieving in the workplace? And, our role is to not avoid it. Our role is to lean in and to listen to the whole person and to really journey with them. So, very happy to share my personal story. I had a very tragic loss, which was the death of my baby. This happened 22 years ago. And my pregnancy, you can't hide a full-term pregnancy in the workplace. Whether you want to share it or not, it's there. And everybody piles on their hopes and dreams, and you share in those. And it's a really wonderful experience. But I sadly found myself in a position where I went back to work without the baby. Now, of course, everybody knew. But in that experience, you know, I'll skip ahead 10 years. I went back to those people and I said, how did you know to treat me so well? How did you know how to be so compassionate? And they all said, well, we didn't. We just had to work it out on the fly. So I'd like to share with you what they did. What they did was they came to visit me in the hospital when they'd found out what had happened. So my boss and two best friends came to visit me in the hospital. They also visited me at home once a week for 4 weeks. And when it was time to go back to work, I had to because I needed to pay my rent. One of them suggested that I went in on a Sunday and they walked through the office with me just so I could smell the office, touch the walls, practice walking to my seat, take a seat. And so the next day on the Monday, when I got into that lift and I went up those levels and the doors opened and I suddenly felt like I didn't relate to this incredible, different, like this completely different world behind the desk, it wasn't so scary because I had practiced it and I knew exactly what was going to happen in that morning. And from that point on, we just muddled in together, really. There was a model that was brought to life in the way that they showed their care and concern for me, which some people call the kvetching model or the circle model. But essentially, in its simplest form, is the person who is grieving is at the center of the model. And the closest people that they have to them show their care and their love and their concern. And then the closest people to those people show their level of care and love and concern, and so on and so on. And then each person just dumps their emotions to the person who's further outwards. So no one told me what a burden I was with my grief. They told someone who was further away. All I felt was all the love and care and concern that came to me. But everybody felt held because everybody had someone to kvetch to, which is a beautiful Yiddish word, which means to moan and to complain. And so my boss, who was quite exhausted after 12 months of grief support for Jess, could complain to her CEO, and he knew that that was the part that he had to play. So to prepare a workplace going forward, it's really useful, I think, to look at this model collectively as a community of people so that when it happens, people can say, what is my role within that? Certainly there was an open door policy with the boss. Certainly there was permission for me to have lots of cups of tea with my work friends as much as I needed it. My performance was poor, but they were committed to me. I was committed to them. And I ended up working there for 10 years and I became the boss because I felt so grateful for their love and concern. So I think how a workplace responds and reacts in that first moment to a grieving person can radically shift that person's feeling towards the culture and towards the leadership and towards their own attachment to that workplace.
Yeah, absolutely. I could hear that so strongly in what you were saying, this sense of both their presence, showing up. And you talked about a similar thing with your own friends, in your TED talk, you said like people showed up and they were sweaty and awkward, and they didn't necessarily know what to do, but they were there, they came,
Yeah.
And so similarly, it sounds like people showed up even if they weren't so sure. But then that other thing of preparing the way and practice, just that gesture of inviting you back into the space, you name those senses, to be in that place on the other side of the experience of death. So often it's grief spoken about as relearning the world. So it's like that opportunity to relearn that without all the additional pressure or all the energy of all the people kind of landing at once. I so often hear that's such a huge obstacle for people returning. So that small and very practical thing, I imagine would feel quite achievable to most people listening, or quite possible. And I wonder if sometimes, before maybe the employee assistance card is handed over, people might assume that the thing to do in terms of being supportive is to tilt their head and look sympathetic and sort of go, and how are you really doing, or something like this, whereas it just sounds much more in tune with what you were actually needing and kind of more down at that practical level.
Yeah. Yeah, you're right, I think. And certainly, grief looks different for all people. There are different types of loss. There's no grief Olympics, but it can have different shades, different color, different heaviness. Grief can be an anniversary, or it can be a sudden thing that's happened. And for each one, it does require that leaning in. And I think a fallback thing that I think is so useful to say when you're not really sure what to say is, I don't know what to say. Because that just buys you so much. Like, it buys you time to think and to feel. It signals to the other person that you're willing and you're open. And you're also willing to be vulnerable by saying you don't know what to say. And you rarely get a response from the grieving person, which is, well, surely you should know what to say. Like, you don't get an angry response. You get a compassionate response.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And look, that all forms part of what we could call grief literacy, I guess, isn't it? That just that willingness to learn a little, and perhaps part of the way towards grief literacy is also opening up a space for stories to be shared by people in that workplace. So, I think you can talk about grief that comes from a divorce as well as grief that comes from a death in order to build grief literacy. So, yeah, so it's a really interesting space, and I think, in terms of some of the practical realities, like you mentioned, HR and industrial relations and things like that also do play a role. But for many of us who just want to have good culture and good grief culture at work, we don't really have a say on some of those things. But the fact that bereavement care in Australia is 2 days, we often say it takes longer to get over a bad haircut. So I think any workplace is going to have to go above and beyond the minimum bereavement care policy.
Yeah, and it's, hopefully those things are in place and do exist in the workplace, and hopefully
Yeah.
workplaces are compassionate. Some I think, I don't want to speculate on the reasons, but just sometimes we know that's just not there, and people are then left with even without a kind of framework to support them in that.
Yeah.
But even when those are there, there's something that seems to be so important in humanizing and personalizing that experience. You don't
Mm-hmm.
kind of relate to people purely through a policy, right? That's there to guide some things,
Yeah.
but that doesn't translate to how you welcome or how you receive that person who's coming back to work, particularly.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I think the stories that we gathered for so many years around compassionate workplaces is the stories of triumph. Like my story, I guess, from the team. It's a story of we rallied around this person who had cancer, and we pulled our unused leave and we gifted it to them. Oh, you can do that? Yes, of course you can do that. So those kind of communal radical acts, I think, is it not only helps the person who's grieving, but it helps everybody involved, because we learn about death through our experiences. So being part of that compassionate community at work is very transformational for individuals. And, there's no downside to gratitude. There's no downside to compassion.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You were talking, in our preparation for this conversation, you were talking about some work you have done supporting workplaces to sort of increase their capacity to support people coming back to work with grief. And you spoke specifically about I was interested in kind of identifying things that could be helpful for people who hold different roles.
Mm-hmm.
Could you talk to us a bit more about that?
Yeah. So I guess, there's perhaps 3 roles. I guess the first one is the grieving. If we find ourselves to be that grieving person, 1 in 4 people, that's 1 in 4 people are grieving at any point in time. And so if we think that we've got on average 30 to 40 years of work life, we are all going to be grieving at work at least twice, 3 times, if I've got the math right. So when we are the grieving people, we need to speak up for our needs. We need to back ourselves. Are we the kind of person to wear our heart on our sleeve and to be quite comfortable to cry in the photocopier room? Do we have photocopier rooms anymore? Probably not. Or are we the kind of person that prefers to keep it, a more private affair, which is absolutely fine and expected. So let's figure that out first and then speak up for our needs. If we find ourselves having to correct people, perhaps we don't need to take that on, Perhaps it's okay just to really practice self-care and self-love. If we're the person who is perhaps the manager or the person in a position who has some influence on how the grieving person's experience is going to go, we certainly want, like the circle model, we want to lean into that person's experience and remind ourselves that we grieve as we live. So personalities don't just suddenly change when someone's grieving. If that person's a private person in their life, they're probably going to be a private person in their grief. So follow that through. We want to ask the person around communication specifically, how would you like this news to be shared, for example? In my situation, I was in touch with a lot of people externally to the organization. I was a community services trainer. So I knew about 70 people and they were all expecting to meet the baby. So I had to figure out with my boss, do we put it in the newsletter? Do we send a private email? So I think that communications role is really important. And I think it changes from week to week. Communications in the first 24 hours is different to what you say a week later. You certainly want to check in every fortnight with the grieving person to make sure that whatever you've got in place doesn't need to be adjusted. You need to, in that role, get care for yourself. You need to say to your partner, I'm dealing with this thing at work. I need an extra cuddle. I need to walk with the dog. I need time out. And look, I guess the other role, is we could either consider it being the closest friends to that person or the general role of everybody in that team. But, from that perspective, it's just general grief literacy and the ability to recognize and respond and don't avoid, and remind ourselves that grief is painful, grief is exhausting, and grief should rarely be avoided. We need to lean in. So, yeah, and I think those different roles can all be discussed with one team. We are the grievers. We are the carers, We don't need to slice these things up. And to have those conversations in workplaces, we can use, for example, Dying to Know Day, our national campaign on the 8th of August. We can use that as a call to action to have a conversation in the workplace. We don't have to use the D word necessarily. We could talk about caring for our elderly parents. We could talk about getting a will. There are just so many different hooks you can use and bring those sorts of conversations into the workplace. We can connect it to just well-being. Most workplaces have a well-being program. We can include grief literacy as part of the well-being program. We can include grief literacy in leadership program. I remember for one company, they were all about passion. We said, just put the com in the front and you've got compassion and there's the hook, right? So, yeah, there's lots of ways to really start that conversation, I guess.
Yeah, and I can hear you saying that, the opportunities to do that certainly don't need to be at the time where you're faced with, the big D in terms of somebody being bereaved that week or that month, or even awaiting, that diagnosis, but that actually they could be looking to take part in some of these broader kind of community conversations and use those as a kind of catalyst again to practice, just like you spoke around the opportunity to go back to the workplace ahead of your actual return. It's equally possible for workplaces to think about this, even if it's a smaller group of people who might have, personal reason to be motivated to go, actually, let's try and think about this, and what are some of the things that might be helpful, or what are things that we want to try and avoid doing, because that can be just as helpful for people to be like, actually, comparing your loss however many years ago of a completely different relative to the person who's just returned to work, maybe not a great idea.
That's so good. It's such a good idea to have a list of no-goes. It's easier actually to strike a line through those things.
Yeah. or that if people are listening to this and then they know that maybe recently or a while ago they clearly did one of those, is just kind of, it's also all right to be like, hey, sorry, that was probably a real clanger.
Yeah,
Try and be better at that. I think still involves some acknowledgement that this is a universally human experience, and just with other forms of relating to people, it's not that we get things right all the time, and it's not that there's some perfect script to follow. It's going to vary depending on the circumstances. Yeah.
so true. I do have to say though, we in some of the workshops we ran, we would always ask, what's the crappiest thing someone said, and we've all said it. So to your point, I've said it. Um, but yeah, the most popular one was the meaning making about how they're in a better place now. I don't know if you've had that one. It was probably the most loathed one. But it's fascinating, isn't it, how we're so drawn to make meaning so quickly about someone's loss. And it's really quite hard to not do that. I mean, our brains are wired to make meaning out of everything. So, but to stay neutral, to stay open,
Yeah, or
challenging.
to stay in that uncertainty, and I think, and the not knowing, right? Especially
Mm.
when that person who is bereaved is in the not knowing. I wonder sometimes if those, even though those statements can come out super clunky, even the ones that might make their way more towards like a Hallmark, kind of sympathy card that have this niceness feel to them, both see a way of the person responding, getting away from that discomfort, or getting away
Yeah.
from, oh, this feels icky. And all of that to say, that makes me think of how useful that model is you talked about earlier, of the circles facing outwards, because it really allows people to check in with, what would be my reason for offering something, further in the circle here. Actually, my thoughts about what I think about that person who's died and where they are and what that means should go outwards and not in. So I
Yeah.
really think that that might be a useful frame for people, in thinking about how to avoid the clangers, maybe.
Yeah. Spot on. Mm.
Thank you so much for your kind of reflections around, it's such a big area of people's grief experience right across the lifespan, kind of in some ways, no matter who the person is who's died, given that grief and death are so universal, this will touch every workplace. And so, yeah, I really value the space for us to kind of highlight that area of community experience. Yeah.
Yeah. My pleasure. And thank you for creating the platform and for thinking about grief in the workplace, not just in the caring services, not just in palliative care or in the hospitals or in the aged care, but actually in all workplaces, because that's where humans are. So I think that's the distinction here, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a good point. Yeah. Yeah. So there was one other thread to our conversation that kind of came up when we were preparing for this chat, and it was, around, I suppose, another key area of, people's experience of grief is where people can turn to connect with other people who are grieving, who share, that lived experience as peers, and where there might be some space to express that collectively. So we've talked to a couple of other people in this series about different, you know, opportunities for collective grief rituals or ceremonies or those sorts of things. So you'd mentioned, I think you said for around the last 15 years, you've been going to your family's been going to a community grief ceremony ahead of Christmas each year. And so
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to invite you to share with people who are listening, how has that communal space for grief, been supportive in your family's life?
Yeah, so we call it the Service for Consolation and Hope, and it's specifically for families, friends, and grandparents and siblings of babies or children who have died. And it was started by two social workers. God bless those social workers in Sydney. And it's held at St Mary's Cathedral in North Sydney on the first Friday of December each year. And look, The format of the ritual is we open with an a cappella choir, and it's the Cafe at the Gates of Salvation, and they raise the roof. You can imagine this 300 person congregation. We just happen to use the church because it's a really big building and it lifts your spirits when you walk in, but it is not a religious ceremony. So the a cappella choir raise the roof and they sing this gospel music. And you've got toddlers running up and down the aisles. You've got nervous people up the back. You've got, committed people up the front and a whole mess of people in the middle. And then we have a sort of some opening words, and then we have a keynote, and that keynote is usually a member of the community. It's a person who's suffered the death of their child or their grandchild. And after that, we sit back and this choir sings again, and then we have this extraordinary PowerPoint show screen on the dome of the roof. And every 4 seconds it ticks over and we see the photo of the baby or the child that has died. And so each member of the community submits their photo every year. If you go every year, your photo just gets carried forward. And my role in this organizing is that I put the PowerPoint together. So I have a 3-month lead up where every few days a photo gets emailed to me. And it's such a privilege to look at that photo and put it into the file. And I'm so grateful for that opportunity to meet these beautiful souls. So this is a ritual that is so important because we know when it happens every year. If our social worker, amazing women, Deb and Belinda, didn't show up one year, we would still be holding this ceremony. So it's not driven by the health sector. And when any of us in this community come across a new grieving parent or grandparent, we invite them along. And that's how it's grown. I'm sure when it started, it only had 10 people in the church, It probably didn't start in the church. It probably started in a neighborhood center or something. I got the opportunity to speak at it, to be the keynote last year, and I got the opportunity to say to the grieving people in the room, this is what it feels like 20 years later. And I also used that 10 minutes to kind of claim a new milestone for myself. And so that space is available for anybody who wants to take it up. And so I just feel so grateful that when people inevitably say, I'm aware you had a stillbirth, my cousin just had a stillbirth, I'm so grateful I can say, bring her along. We're all there, So it's incredibly important. And one of the things that we want to do going forward is just to capture some of the magic of it in some sort of a playbook or a document, so that it could spring up in any other community. And how other people do it will be different. But we've certainly got some lessons that we can share. And during COVID, we started to broadcast the ceremony. And so there's still about 300 people in the room on the day. But, I think there was about 500 viewing from the comfort of their own home. And they could still submit their photo and have everybody witness it. So, yeah, it's just growing and going from strength to strength. And it's just a really lovely communal organizing that sits behind it as well. No one's got any tickets on themselves. Everybody has to muck in on the day,
Yeah. And it's you've given us such a, I think, vivid and rich, kind of description, both of the format and the feel of the thing. And, I don't know if this is a bit of an impossible question, but I'm really interested or curious as to what it is about being a part of that event or that gathering that, is different from maybe being with 1 or 2 friends or a much smaller group. Like, what is it about that communal space, I think, that is it different? And what is it if it is?
Yeah, it's the witnessing. It's realizing you're not alone. It's just realizing that, you discover this if you're in the position of having, being a bereaved parent, that parents around the world have their babies die. It's just such a universal experience. It doesn't feel like that in the beginning. You feel like you're all on your own and you feel like, what did I do to deserve this? And then if you're lucky enough for me, I read the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People, and that flipped the script in my head. And I realized, why wouldn't it happen to me? I am part of nature. I am nature.
Mm.
So you might realize that on your own, but when you have the witnessing of that, when you look in each other's eyes when there's 300 people in the room, and you smile and you nod, or you avoid, you just do all the things that people do between in the spaces in between. There's just this incredible relief that comes over you, and you actually feel proud to be part of that community. You know, you've survived something that's really shared. You wouldn't wish it on your greatest enemy, but you've spun some gold with it because you're able to be compassionate with each other. And I think that one aspect of that grief, in that particular type of grief, is you feel, for me anyway, in my words, I feel like God reached out and slapped me across the face, and it leaves you feeling with this overwhelming sense of humility. You kind of fall to your knees and you just ask for forgiveness. I don't believe in God, but still, it was a strong enough metaphor for me to put a name to it. That's how it felt.
Yeah.
And when you kind of share that, when you're in the room with 300 people and they go, yeah, me too. Yeah, wow. Yeah, no, I had different words, but that's exactly how I felt. You don't get stuck in that. It's not wallowing, you don't get stuck in some sort of wallow thing where you don't know where to go and it's all a bit depressing. You've got music, you've got camaraderie, you've got story, it's time bound. You're not there forever. You're there for an hour and a half. Get in, get out, get on with living, But it's ritual that's done really well. And it's an add-on. And I think smaller spaces and smaller communities is absolutely important too, and it's a part of it. But that public outpouring, I mean, if we remember too, the bombing in Martin Place 8 years ago, 9 years ago, such a shocking thing to happen to the city. But thousands of people came into Martin Place and laid down their flowers, and we had to be together to just have that moment of recognition and witnessing that I'm not just feeling these feelings alone.
Yeah. And that in itself, it's not seeking to, well, these aren't situations, I was going to say, it's not seeking to fix. Like, it's so impossible
Yeah.
that to fix or to even make better, especially for people who are in those very early and raw kind of days and weeks and months. But there's something in that witnessing, I think, that is so important and so valued by people when they find it. And I think it's a reflection of some of the challenge, like you've said, spoke right at the start of today about how death and dying became so medicalized. And while that provides, much more effective and supportive symptom relief in much better space, it's not an either or binary, but that has come at a cost. And one of the costs has been the loss of things like collective witnessing. So people are even worried before they go to an event like that. Like you said, it's not wallowing. It's like often we hear when we put on grief, grief ceremonies or things of groups of that nature, people, I think, have some concern. Is it going to be this kind of,
Right.
just sad town of people just making each other progressively more sad until they're sadder or something? But it's, and that's why I felt like it might be an impossible question. But I think you've done such an insightful way of reflecting on it, that difference between wallowing and witnessing. So thank you.
Well,
And
that's a good way to put it, wallowing and witnessing.
that was you.
Oh no, but you made it much more succinct than me. But the other thing I've just realized too, and maybe this was obvious in what I said, was there are new people and there are old people. So at every event, there's always the new mum who comes along, and she's got the little blanket and she's got the tissues, and she's surrounded by 3 very protective people, and we just soft front, stiffed back, we just watch her walk past us because we're at kind of the door greeting people, and we just keep a little eye on her. But then you've got people like me who I'm really comfortable with. I'm 20 years down the track, sister, so I'll have a laugh, I'll have a cry, but I'll have a laugh too. And all of those mixes is what makes it the witnessing. I think that's what makes it work.
Yeah. absolutely. And that everyone is themselves in that process. That new mother, that new parent will in time be someone who can turn around and offer their own,
Yeah.
medicine and kind of witnessing of that.
Mm.
Yeah. Jessie, thank you so much for everything you've shared with us today. I just wanted to double check. I think you said that playbook, in terms of how people might start their own ceremonies and things like that. That sounds like something that's in development. So perhaps people can reach out to you if that's something they're interested in keeping updated with. Uh,
Absolutely. Just happy to have a chat with anybody. And
yeah.
yeah, when we've got something to share, we'll certainly share it, but always up for a conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, and we'll certainly link to everything else we've mentioned in terms of resources today in the show notes as well. So yeah, just thank you
Great.
again so much for sharing your experience and your wisdom, from all of your work in this space. We really appreciate it.
Very welcome. Thanks, Ellen.